What is different about the bear market that we're heading into now, maybe even a recession, compared to past ones?
Yeah, it's a big change. I think anyone who's been investing the last 40 years has kind of seen one kind of Federal Reserve, right? And that response is almost immediate. When S&P is down 10, 15%, you typically start hearing the chatter. They should do something, either send a message that they're going to expand the balance sheet or cut interest rates, some combination thereof. So the last 8 bear markets in the US, we've seen that exact response. We saw it in 2020, of course, with the immediate move down to zero in terms of interest rates, and then the biggest expansion of the balance sheet that we've ever seen. But even before that, in 2018, we saw them immediately stop hiking rates and then start cutting rates and launch another round of QE. So pretty much every bear market, even the 1987 crash, that's really where it started under Alan Greenspan. You've seen the Fed ease into that. Today, very much different situation. The Fed has already hiked rates a few times, and they're expected to continue to hike rates to above 3% by the end of the year. So kind of ignoring that decline in the market. And the reason is because we haven't seen inflation be the threat it is today since the early 1980s. So the last time we had a bear market where the Fed took a hawkish position in the midst of that was under Paul Volcker in the early 1980s. And we're faced with kind of a similar market today, except that the Fed today is so far behind that curve.
So when you say that they're behind the curve, one of the things it feels like is they were still, doing asset purchases earlier this year, even though they were talking tough at the exact time. Like, how do you analyze what they're saying versus what they're doing? And is there any kind of frameworks that you've, kind of distilled over time that really helps you separate words from actions?
Yeah, it was just an incredible disconnect, right? We saw last year, even if you thought that, heading into 2021, let's say you had the position that inflation wasn't going to be a problem. By the middle of the year, it was pretty clear to everyone that inflation was rising, and particularly in the housing market, we saw month after month of record highs and demand really fueling that. So there was, in my opinion, and I think any reasonable person's opinion, there was no rational reason to continue to buy mortgage bonds last year and into this year with the housing market doing what it did. And 0% rates just made 0 sense last year, given the risk reward of the situation. So their number one job, as a Fed under their mandate, is to control, to have price stability. And, they had the low unemployment rate, so that really wasn't a factor. And they just kind of ignored it. And we find ourselves in the position today where they're behind the curve. And so they have to be, rapidly catching up. So, really the pain that could have been avoided was just that additional excess and upside in terms of the meme stocks and everything else, in terms of people jumping into risk, forced into risky assets. And now we're seeing the other side of that, unfortunately.
Why do you think that they continued? Was it they just didn't want to rock the boat? Was it something like politically motivated? Was it just ignorance? What was it?
Yeah, I think it's a combination thereof. The politics, the Fed, unfortunately, has gotten more and more political. I think we've seen that in recent years, and especially with the huge increase in national debt, right? We added $6 trillion. That didn't happen in a vacuum. That couldn't have happened without the Fed monetizing that and buying a good chunk of that debt and adding it to their balance sheet. So to me, that was really the politicization of the Fed. And the Fed has kind of had this idea that the base case scenario should be easing. And that started under Greenspan, but it really accelerated under Bernanke. And the idea was that easing should always be preferable, because we're not really worried about inflation. And if you're not worrying about inflation, why not ease? Why not just make that your base case scenario? Of course, anyone in emerging markets countries can tell you why, right? They've experienced it, and anybody living in the 1970s could tell you why as well. But it was just too far removed from us for that to be a real concern. And so that pass it on to the next Fed, and same thing with what the government does, pass it on to the next. So we'll continue doing what we're doing until we're really forced to move. And now they're in the position where really they've lost most of the credibility, I believe, that they had. But if they want to retain any credibility here, they have to start moving higher, and it's only because of that they're really being forced to that they're doing so. And so at a certain point here, we'll likely see them flip and go back in the opposite direction. But the optics today are too much for them to just simply ignore, right? We have the lowest consumer confidence in history. We have gas prices above $5 a gallon for the first time in history. You have any number of factors, but inflation is the main reason people are feeling angst, and for good reason. Their wages are not keeping up with the inflation now for 14 consecutive months, and that's a lot. And so the Fed really has to try to at least do something about it.
So when you start to look at the data that they are using, obviously CPI is the thing that everyone's been paying attention to for the last year or so. I appreciate the fact that we probably see eye to eye on it's bullshit. Like, there's just no way that the CPI prints appear to be accurate. And can you walk us through like why you don't think the CPI measurement is maybe reflecting what they think it's reflecting?
Yeah, the big factor today, I'm not one of these people who think that historically, inflation was 10% and it was really 2%. Certainly it's probably a bit higher than the reported figures if you're going back, let's say 20, 30 years. But I think the big disconnect has been in the past year or so and looking at the housing numbers. And housing, as you know, is the biggest component of CPI. It's what people spend most of their budget on. Over 33% of that index is just in housing. And they just have an antiquated measure, in my view, and they have some justifications for it, of measuring the cost of housing, cost of shelter. We're really, instead of looking at market prices, whether it's rents, which are up 15% over the last year, or housing prices nationally, which are up over 20%, which is the highest increase we've seen year over year on record. They're going around and polling people and asking them what they would rent their homes out for, something called owner's equivalent rent. And when they do that, apparently the answers to those polls are much lower than the actual statistics. So because of that, that 8.6% figure, if we're using, the actual housing inflation that we've seen over the past year, would obviously be well above 10%. So it's just a function, that's the big driver in terms of the index. And maybe, over the long run, that smooths itself out. But, over the past year, that's been just, really underreporting the actual rate of inflation, in the economy.
How do you think about the demand for real estate once rates start to increase? We have seen the mortgage rate explode upwards. Is this just a simple supply demand? Hey, demand cools, the rates go up, we should expect real estate prices to fall, and don't make this too complicated and keep it simple?
Yeah, I mean, it's not as simple as that, as the stock market, where it reprices very quickly, but it has to impact demand, and we're seeing that already. So the mortgage rate bottomed at 2.65% early 2021. And it's doubled since then. And so if you're looking at the payment, right, the average payment, if you put 20% down, it's pretty much doubled over that period of time. And you have home prices up, 20, 30% since then. So if that doesn't impact demand, then nothing will. And it is already. If we looked at new home sales last month, they really collapsed. And I think we'll see that continue. And, the housing market, this is really a second bubble we've seen in the housing market, and it could have, to some extent, been avoided. I don't think it should be a national policy that we've kind of made it, in terms of the Fed saying that we want to create these housing bubbles. And the theory was that under the wealth effect, if people's homes went up in price, then they would spend more money. And that is true to a certain extent in the short run. But you don't want to create a situation where housing is unaffordable based on incomes. We saw that in the mid 2000s, and now we're seeing again today. It's at the lowest affordability. You got to go back to 2007. to see that. And that's not good for an economy long run. You want housing to be affordable because it's not a productive good. So, driving prices up, ahead of fundamentals for the housing market is bad for everyone, right? It increases your taxes, increases insurance. So we've seen all these things go up. So I'm not sure what the thinking is beyond, again, that theoretical concept, which is we just want asset prices to go up so people spend more. I think hopefully people will learn after the housing market comes in here. And we don't have to see a collapse like we did the last time, but you have to see a normalization. You just can't have long-term housing prices stretched in relations to income. It has to give one way or another. Either you loosen lending standards, which we don't want to see, right? We don't want to see go back to having subprime and people only putting a few percent down, or people lying about their incomes. That's one way to avoid the collapse. Or two is we just have to take the medicine and say at 7 times. Home prices are 7 times now above incomes, and that's the highest we've ever seen. And perhaps that's too much, and perhaps we shouldn't pursue that as a goal, as a policy, right? So just letting the market instead of the Fed determine, where housing prices should be. I think that makes sense. Why do we entrust, really, is a big question, not just for housing, but for the stock market, for the economy in general. Why do we trust that 10 people sitting in a room can determine the most important interest rate in the economy? I'm not sure why we do that, right? We wouldn't do that with food. Where we seem to go to the grocery store and have food each week, and there's not some central planner figuring out, what quantities to put in different amounts and how much to produce, right? The market's driving that. So why should it be different with interest rates? We're really entrusting these people, giving them a lot of responsibility and giving them perhaps the respect that they don't deserve, because based on history, they've gotten it wrong how many times, right? And I'm going to say I would do any better. Right. But, leaving them to determine what the interest rate should be or when they should buy bonds or not buy bonds. It just seems misguided, because it's going to lead to a misallocation of capital, right? You're driving people into asset classes based on that interest rate, that manipulated interest rate, rather than the underlying fundamentals, right, of that sector.
Hey, you, did you like this video? Great. We make 5 of them a day and post them here on this channel. Make sure you subscribe, like the video, and see you next time.